During the late 80s and early 90s, the 49ers had a problem every other team would be drooling for. 3 quarterbacks, 1 room, 2 Hall of Famers, and a Pro Bowler. Which one do you start? It was the most stacked quarterback room in NFL history. But with all that talent in one place, it also created one of the most heated quarterback controversies ever. Joe Montana was already an icon a few years into his career, but injuries were piling up. So head coach Bill Walsh brought in Steve Young. But Steve Young wasn't just a backup. He was also a future Hall of Famer. When Montana got hurt, Steve Young seized the opportunity. Except he wasn't the only one. Enter Steve Bono, a third stringer who, when given the opportunity, played so well that even Steve Young had to watch from the sidelines. So how did the 49ers navigate this unprecedented dilemma? And who would ultimately emerge as the guy? This is the story of the most overpowered quarterback room in NFL history. What you saying, guys? It's Zane here. Let's get into it. To understand how the 49ers got here, we have to start with the man who built the dynasty, Joe Montana. Drafted in 1979, Montana became the foundation of a team that would dominate the next decade. But even for a future Hall of Famer, his rise to greatness wasn't immediate. He didn't become a full-time starter until midway through the 1980 season and finished that year with a 2-5 record. That being said, there were flashes, as Montana's 64.5% completion percentage led the league. More importantly though, the world got to see the real Joe Cool in the first game of the 1980 season. Down 35-21 against the Saints in the fourth quarter, Joe Montana orchestrated his first fourth quarter comeback victory as the 49ers won 38-35 in overtime. Then, in just his second season, the 49ers went 13-3 on their way to the NFC Championship game against the Cowboys. This would be a defining moment in Montana's career, and therefore 49ers history. Down 27-21, the 49ers had 4 minutes and 54 seconds remaining, starting at their 11-yard line. They marched down the field under Montana's steady hand, easily reaching the Cowboys' 6-yard line. But after an incomplete pass and a 6-yard run, it was now third down. Montana got the snap and ran to the right. As he was falling back, he threw the ball towards the back of the end zone. Dwight Clark, who was drafted the same year as Montana, came in with a leaping catch. 51 seconds left, the score was now 28-27. The 49ers would win that game, and that moment would be immortalized in what is just called the catch. Very clever name, not sure how they came up with that one. They were now on their way to their first Super Bowl, in which they would beat the Bengals 26-21, as Montana became the second youngest quarterback behind Joe Namath to win a Super Bowl. The 1982 season was shortened to 9 games due to a player strike, but Montana still lit it up. However, the 49ers went 3-6 and missed the playoffs, so they actually considered trading Joe Montana to the Colts for the 1983 pick, which would have been John Elway. Yeah, the guy who just won you a Super Bowl and showed no signs of slowing down was considered a tradable asset. Montana would go on to show the stupidity of such an idea, I mean as great as John Elway would have been, because following that season he received 6 more Pro Bowl nods, 2 MVPs, 3 first-team All-Pros, oh yeah, and another 3 Super Bowls. But just as Montana was asserting himself as the greatest quarterback ever, head coach Bill Walsh was scheming up some mayhem. In 1976, so a few years before the 49ers had drafted Joe Montana, the NFL was expanding. They had just added 2 new teams, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Seattle Seahawks. The Buccaneers, quite literally, couldn't have had a worse start. 0-14 their first season, followed by a 2-12 season. They lost 26 of 28 games in their first 2 years, and they didn't win those 2 games until the final 2 weeks of the season, so basically 2 years without a single win. But while Tampa Bay struggled, a young quarterback would soon make his way into the league. Steve Young joined the LA Express of the USFL in 1984. After 2 years, the team's operations were suspended. Following that, Steve Young bought out his contract and set his sights on the NFL. Unfortunately, it seems his vision had been impaired with all those hits, because he'd signed with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers after they drafted him first overall in the supplemental draft. Now, the Bucs had seen a little bit of success following those 2 horrendous seasons, but they'd quickly fallen back into their old ways, having just gone 2-14, 6-10, and 2-14. That would be the start of a 12-year saga of losing at least 10 games a season, so Young really had no chance of succeeding. And he didn't, throwing just 11 touchdowns and 21 interceptions while completing less than 55% of his passes. Bill Walsh understood this, seeing Young's bad stats as a reflection of the team rather than Young's lack of talent. The Bucs disagreed. They thought he was a bust and looked to move on from him. But the 49ers still had Joe Montana in his prime. They didn't need a backup like Steve Young. Well, Montana had just suffered a severe back injury in 1986. It was so bad, doctors suggested that Montana retire. But just 9 weeks later, he returned and threw for 270 yards and 3 touchdowns in a 43-17 victory against the Cardinals. So much for modern medicine, right? Even though he threw more interceptions and touchdowns that season, the only time of his career, he clearly did not need to retire. The NFL took note as he won the 1986 Comeback Player of the Year award. Bill Walsh still traded for Young though, who arrived with the understanding that Montana, who had 2 back surgeries, would not be coming back. But when Steve Young arrived at training camp in 1987, that was clearly not the case, kickstarting a cute little quarterback controversy. Steve Young was obviously not going to replace Joe Montana, but Walsh would throw Young into games here and there, sometimes pulling Montana out if they were down really bad. And when Young played, he played pretty well, which only added to the Montana vs. Young drama. Walsh, behind closed doors, also floated the possibility of trading Montana. Yes, trading Montana was considered again in 1987. Thankfully, nothing came of it, but Bill Walsh continued to add fuel to the fire, playing Montana and Young during the first 10 weeks of the 1988 season. But as that year progressed, the constant back and forth between the two quarterbacks ended up hurting the 49ers as they limped to a 6-5 record. Walsh had to commit to one, and he'd commit to the king. Montana went on to win another 2 Super Bowls and 2 MVPs. Meanwhile, Steve Young watched patiently from the sidelines. But 1991 would be a turning point. Montana would miss the season with an elbow injury after going down against the Giants in the previous season's NFC Championship game. Finally, Young thought, now is my chance. Well, he wouldn't make the most of that chance, as the 49ers started the season 4-4. Then, in week 9, Young suffered a knee injury. His replacement? Steve Bono, a future Pro Bowler, who had seen no playing time in his first 5 years in the league. But after the Steelers allowed him to become a free agent, he'd sign with the 49ers in 1989 and become a third-string quarterback. That would complete the lineup for the most stacked quarterback room in NFL history. So after Young injured his knee, Bono stepped in and went 5-1 as the starter. He played so well, head coach George Seifert opted to keep Bono as the starter. After waiting 4 years, being teased along the way, Steve Young had just lost his shot and was now back watching from the sideline. But the injury bug struck again, as Bono went down in week 15. Steve Young returned and was set on keeping his spot as the starter this time. Despite him missing 6 games, he still led the league with a 101.8 passer rating as he threw for over 2,500 yards, 17 touchdowns, and only 8 interceptions. But the 49ers, who had just gone 14-2 the previous season, slipped to a 10-6 record and just missed the playoffs, the first time since 1982. With Joe Montana almost recovered, there was a suggestion to trade Young as Bono had proven to be a worthwhile backup. So the 49ers prepared to trade Young to the Raiders, but the deal actually fell through. As it turned out, Montana wouldn't be healthy till the final game of the season, so it worked out for the best. But Montana, who had accumulated 2 seasons of rust, still showed he was Joe freaking Montana as he played the second half of the final game, leading the 49ers to a victory over the Lions. Now, in the first game of that season, Steve Young went down with a concussion and Bono threw for 2 touchdowns in a 31-14 victory. The excellent play from all of these quarterbacks simply intensified the drama. Who do you keep? Joe Montana has been injured for 2 seasons, but he clearly still has it. Bono is a great backup. Do you move on from the GOAT and go with Steve Young? Well, Steve Young would use that season to settle the debate. Returning from his concussion in week 2, yeah, so much for concussion protocol, he rattled off 13 wins and won league MVP. But Montana was still on the roster, and the 49ers went on to lose to the Cowboys in the championship game. Following a division in the locker room on who should actually be the team's quarterback, Montana was ultimately traded to the Chiefs. Young was now the starter, no question about it. Bono was still there, but now it was Young's team. The following season, in 1994, Bono would also be shipped to the Chiefs to back up Joe Montana. And following Montana's retirement, Bono started in 1995, where he'd get a Pro Bowl nod and lead the Chiefs to a 13-3 record. As for Young, he proved to be a worthy successor, as he led the 49ers to their first Super Bowl appearance since 1989. I know, only 4 years. Poor 49ers fans, I have no idea how they put up with such mediocrity. Facing the Chargers, Steve Young ripped off 6 touchdowns, surpassing the Super Bowl record for most touchdowns set by Joe Montana. He also became the first player to ever lead in rushing and passing yards as the 49ers crushed the Chargers 49-26. That would complete one of the greatest seasons by a quarterback ever. Just shy of 4,000 yards, 35 touchdowns to 10 interceptions, a 70.3% completion percentage, the highest ever up until 2009, and a then record 112.8 passer rating. He'd inevitably earn MVP for such a year. But while Young played well the following 2 seasons, the 49ers didn't have the same postseason success. Then in week 3 of 1999, against the Cardinals, Steve Young took a big sack that led to his 7th concussion. That would put him out for the rest of the season, and it was enough to force him to retire. Such a trio of quarterbacks will likely never be seen again following the introduction of the salary cap. But while it lasted, it was pretty interesting. By the way, if you like this concept, let me know. I have some ideas for most stacked at other positions as well.